At 65 years old, Eleanor believed that love and sacrifice were currencies that never lost their value. She believed that if you poured your entire soul into building a family, that family would protect you when the winter of your life arrived. She was about to find out just how wrong she was. After 35 years of caring for a man, a sprawling mansion, and an entire life that she realized was never truly hers, she expected the reading of her late husband's will to be a mere formality, a final goodbye. But as the attorney read Arthur's final wishes in a room filled with her anxious, greedy stepchildren, the silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor wasn't just forgotten. She was erased, eliminated, as if 3.5 decades of absolute devotion could be wiped away with a single signature. While the stepchildren exchanged victorious smirks, already dividing up the millions, Eleanor was handed what they called the rest, a rusty brass key and a hand-scrawled address to a place she had never heard of. She was 65, virtually homeless, and discarded by the man she had loved with every fiber of her being. But what those arrogant heirs were too blind to realize is that greed makes you reckless. They took the money that runs out and the houses that age, but Eleanor, she was just handed the key to a secret empire her husband had been hiding for 35 years. If you have ever felt invisible, if you've ever poured your heart into people who took you for granted or felt like the world underestimated you because of your age, this story is exactly for you. Welcome to Alex's Stories. Before we reveal what Eleanor found when that rusty brass key finally turned the lock, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video. Because what you are about to hear will make you believe that divine karma never ever gets the address wrong. Eleanor was 30 years old when she married Arthur Sterling. Arthur was a titan of Chicago real estate, a brilliant, wealthy, and commanding architect whose presence took up all the oxygen in any room he entered. He was a widower with 3 teenagers, Robert, Victoria, and Julian. From the day of the wedding, the stepchildren made their feelings crystal clear. To them, Eleanor was just the woman who took their mother's place. "You're just a guest in our family," a teenage Victoria had once hissed at her. "Don't ever think you belong here." But Eleanor tried anyway. For 35 years, she played the perfect supporting role. She remembered every birthday, cooked every Thanksgiving dinner, and maintained their magnificent Lake Forest mansion with flawless grace. She was Arthur's rock. When his architectural firm faced crises, she stayed up with him until dawn. When his health began to fail in his later years, she became his full-time caregiver, changing his bandages and managing his medications so he wouldn't have to face the humiliation of hiring a nurse. She lived a comfortable life, yes, but it was a life lived entirely in the shadows. She had no career of her own, no separate bank accounts, and over the years, she had lost touch with her own friends. Her entire universe was Arthur. And then, on a rainy Tuesday in November, Arthur's heart simply stopped. Exactly 1 week after the lavish Chicago funeral, the family gathered at the downtown office of Arthur's estate lawyer. Eleanor sat on one side of the massive mahogany table, dressed in modest black, her hands trembling slightly. Across from her sat Robert, Victoria, and Julian, flanked by their expensive attorneys. They looked like wolves waiting for a cage to open. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading. "The Sterling estate is valued at approximately $12 million, including the Lake Forest estate, liquid assets, and stock portfolios." Eleanor let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. 12 million. Surely Arthur had made sure she would be safe for her remaining years. "The Lake Forest estate," the lawyer continued, not making eye contact with Eleanor, "is left in its entirety to my 3 children to be sold or demolished as they see fit. The investment portfolios and all liquid assets are to be divided equally among Robert, Victoria, and Julian." A freezing dread began to creep up Eleanor's spine. The house wasn't hers. The money wasn't hers. "I don't understand," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking. "What about me?" The lawyer looked genuinely pained. He picked up a separate sheet of paper. "Arthur insisted on this specific wording, Eleanor. I am so sorry. I am legally bound to read it exactly as written." He took a breath. "My wife, Eleanor, has lived lavishly at my expense for 35 years. She has enjoyed the privileges of my wealth, my home, and my high society standing, a lifestyle she could never have achieved on her own. I deem this to be more than adequate compensation for the domestic and medical services she has provided me. My true legacy belongs to my bloodline. Therefore, she is given exactly 30 days to vacate the Lake Forest property. Adequate compensation for domestic and medical services. The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow to the chest. 35 years of love. 35 years of holding his hand through the darkest nights, reduced to a service contract that had just expired. She wasn't his partner. In the end, he saw her exactly as his children did, as an unpaid employee. Across the table, Robert let out a soft, mocking chuckle. Victoria was already looking at her phone, likely texting a real estate agent to list the mansion. Eleanor's world spun. She was 65 years old. She hadn't worked a paying job since the 1980s. She had no savings, no home, and nowhere to go. Visions of cheap, state-funded nursing homes and homeless shelters flashed before her eyes. The terror was suffocating. "There is one last thing," the lawyer said, interrupting her panic. He slid a small, heavy brown envelope across the polished table. "Arthur left this for you. He said it was your sole inheritance." With shaking hands, Eleanor opened the envelope. Inside was no check, no hidden bank account number. It was just a heavy, rusty brass key, and a small piece of Arthur's thick stationery with a single line of his precise handwriting. "The Haven, Oakhaven, Michigan. Go there, Eleanor. Trust me one last time. Trust me one last time." After publicly humiliating her, after stripping her of her dignity and leaving her penniless, Eleanor stood up. She didn't scream. 35 years of training as a polite society wife kept her face completely blank. She took the rusty key, turned her back on the smirking stepchildren, and walked out into the freezing Chicago rain. She had 30 days to pack up a 35-year lie. But as she gripped that cold brass key in her pocket, a tiny spark of something unfamiliar began to ignite in her chest. She had absolutely nothing left to lose. And sometimes, having nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind of freedom. The 30 days that followed the reading of the will were a masterclass in calculated cruelty. For Robert, Victoria, and Julian, entitlement wasn't just an attitude, it was an art form. And Eleanor, the woman who had essentially raised them, was forced to be their silent audience. They didn't kick her out immediately. The law mandated 30 days, but they made sure she felt every agonizing second of it. They came to the Lake Forest mansion almost every day. They didn't knock. They simply walked through the front door with contractors, interior designers, and real estate agents trailing behind them like a royal court. They marched through the grand hallways with measuring tapes and paint swatches, loudly discussing their plans to gut the house, rip out the mahogany floors, and completely modernize the gardens Eleanor had spent 3 decades cultivating. One morning, Eleanor was sitting at the kitchen island, quietly sipping her coffee. Victoria breezed into the room with a trendy young architect. Victoria didn't even glance in Eleanor's direction. It was as if she were looking right through her. "We're definitely taking a sledgehammer to this entire wall," Victoria said, waving a manicured hand at the space where Eleanor had lovingly hung Arthur's architectural awards and family portraits. "This kitchen is so painfully outdated. It screams 1990s housewife. We need an open concept if we're going to list this place for $5 million. Another afternoon, Robert stood in the living room with a high-end realtor. They were discussing staging strategies just 3 feet from where Eleanor was reading a book. "The rose gardens are severely overgrown," the realtor noted, looking out the French doors at the very roses Eleanor had planted with her own hands, kneeling in the soil spring after spring. "We'll need to bulldoze those beds and lay down some fresh sod. Buyers want low maintenance, not a botanical garden." Those were Eleanor's roses, her vision, her life's work now. They were just overgrown obstacles blocking a profitable sale. To her stepchildren, Eleanor wasn't a person grieving the loss of her husband. She was just another piece of unwanted, outdated furniture that came with the property. A ghost haunting a house that no longer belonged to her. But the days were nothing compared to the nights. The nights were when the true, suffocating terror took hold. Eleanor would lie awake in the massive master bedroom, which Robert had graciously allowed her to use since the furniture needed to stay for staging purposes, and her mind would spiral into a dark abyss of catastrophic scenarios. She was 65 years old. She hadn't held a paying job since 1989. Her resume was completely blank for 35 years. Who would hire her? A grocery store, a fast food restaurant? Could her aging joints even handle standing for 8 hours a day? And what about that mysterious property in Oak Haven, Michigan, the Haven? Victoria had laughed when she heard the name. She'd claimed it was probably a rotting cabin Arthur had inherited decades ago and forgot to sell, a tear down in the middle of nowhere. Victoria had smirked. Maybe she can sell the firewood. If Victoria was right, the property might be worth $20,000 or $30,000 at best. That might last Eleanor a year or two if she ate ramen noodles and never got sick. And then what? She pictured herself at 70, destitute, shivering in a state-funded nursing facility, dependent on charity, forgotten by the world. Some nights the fear was so intense that Eleanor couldn't breathe. Her chest would tighten, her heart would pound furiously against her ribs, and she would have to get up and pace the dark hallways, tears streaming down her face, trying desperately to calm down. And then the fear would curdle into a blinding white-hot rage. How dare Arthur do this to her? How dare he let her spend 35 years believing they were partners, building a legacy together, only to reveal in death that she was nothing more than an unpaid maid? How dare he choose his selfish, entitled children over the woman who had sacrificed her entire existence for him? But anger requires energy, and Eleanor's energy was rapidly depleting. Maintaining fury is exhausting when you are simultaneously paralyzed by fear. So mostly, she just felt numb. The profound isolation of her reality sank in. She had no parents left. She was an only child. She had no children of her own. Arthur had said 3 were enough. She had sacrificed her friendships to host Arthur's corporate dinners and manage his social calendar. She had no one to call, no shoulder to cry on, no safety net. She was entirely, utterly alone. On her final morning in the Lake Forest mansion, Eleanor woke before dawn. She walked through each room one last time. She expected to feel a profound, overwhelming sadness. She expected to be crushed by 35 years of memories. Instead, she felt almost nothing. The master bedroom was just 4 walls and a bed that was never truly hers. The grand dining room was just a place where she had cooked thousands of meals that went largely unappreciated. The only place that actually hurt was the garden. Standing in the cold morning air, looking at the roses that were about to be bulldozed, she touched a freezing petal. This was the only space in 35 years that had felt authentically hers. By 1 p.m., Eleanor was loading her car. 3 suitcases, 2 small boxes of personal photos and books from her childhood. That was it. 35 years of an opulent life reduced to the trunk of a 10-year-old Honda Accord. Robert arrived early to ensure she actually left on time. He stood on the porch checking his Rolex. "The movers for the staging furniture will be here at 2, he said, not meeting her eyes. "Just leave the house keys on the kitchen counter." Eleanor paused by her car door. She looked at Robert, the boy she had helped with his college applications, the boy she had nursed through pneumonia. "Robert," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying a heavy, unfamiliar weight. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to give someone 35 years of your life and be told it meant absolutely nothing?" Robert's face flushed red. "Defensive? Dad left you a property in Michigan? You're not getting nothing." "Your father left me a rusty key and a mystery," Eleanor replied evenly. "You and your siblings got millions, this mansion, and the satisfaction of knowing your father valued your blood over my devotion. I got 30 days to disappear. So, no, Robert, I don't think you have the slightest concept of what this feels like." Before he could respond, before the numbness could crack and the tears could fall, she got into her car and shut the door. On the passenger seat lay the heavy brown envelope. Her GPS displayed the destination, Oak Haven, Michigan. 3 hours and 40 minutes away, a drive into the absolute unknown. As Eleanor Sterling drove away from the wrought iron gates of the Chicago mansion for the very last time, she made a quiet vow to herself. Whatever she found at the end of that GPS route, whether it was a rotting cabin or an empty lot of dirt, she would find a way to survive it. She was 65 years old. She had lost her youth, her home, and her husband's loyalty. The only thing she had left was her dignity, and she would be damned if she let them take that too, because Eleanor was beginning to realize a terrifying yet exhilarating truth. When you have absolutely nothing left to lose, you become completely unstoppable. Oak Haven, Michigan turned out to be exactly the kind of place Victoria would despise. It was a tiny, forgotten dot on the map, nestled against the shores of a cold, gray lake. The main street consisted of perhaps a dozen buildings clustered around a town square, a faded general store, a diner with neon signs buzzing weakly in the afternoon light, a tiny post office, and a library that looked like it hadn't been painted since the 1970s. As Eleanor drove slowly through the town, following the robotic voice of her GPS, she noticed something peculiar. The locals, a man sweeping the sidewalk, a teenager outside the diner, stopped and watched her car pass, not with hostility, but with an odd, quiet recognition. It was almost as if they had been waiting for her. Her GPS directed her off the paved road and onto a winding dirt path that disappeared into a dense, ancient oak forest. The trees were massive, their branches forming a thick green canopy that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns on her windshield. The road was deeply rutted, forcing her to drive at a crawl. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 miles, the mechanical voice announced cheerfully, "You have arrived at your destination." Eleanor stopped the car. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. For a long moment, she couldn't bring herself to look up. She was terrified that Victoria had been right, that she would find nothing but a rotting, collapsed cabin in a patch of weeds. She took a deep, trembling breath and finally lifted her eyes. What lay before her was not a rotting cabin. It wasn't a teardown. Sitting in a massive, sunlit clearing, surrounded by the ancient oaks like silent guardians, was an estate, a stunning, sprawling home built from rough-hewn gray stone and rich, dark timber. It looked like something out of an English countryside novel. It had a steep slate roof that appeared completely intact, leaded glass windows that caught the afternoon sun, and a heavy carved oak front door under a sweeping portico. The grounds were overgrown, yes, but Eleanor, with her gardener's eye, could instantly see the magnificent bones of the landscaping. Stone pathways snaked through wild, untamed rose bushes and what had clearly once been a massive kitchen garden. There was even a silent, elegant stone fountain in the center of a courtyard. It was wild and overgrown, but it was hauntingly, breathtakingly beautiful. A secret garden that time had touched but not destroyed. As Eleanor sat frozen in her car, trying to process the impossibility of what she was seeing, she heard the crunch of footsteps approaching. An older woman, perhaps in her early 70s, wearing a practical canvas jacket and carrying a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth, was walking purposefully down the dirt road toward the car. "You must be Eleanor," the woman said as she reached the window. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of absolute certainty. "Yes," Eleanor managed to whisper, stepping out on legs that felt like jelly. How did you know?" "We've been waiting for you," the woman said simply, offering a warm, weather-beaten smile. "Arthur told us you'd come eventually after he passed. He said to watch for a woman named Eleanor driving a dark Honda." "I'm Martha. I run the general store in town." Martha held out the basket. "I brought bread, eggs, milk, coffee. Figured you might need supplies. The house has been perfectly maintained, but there's no fresh food stocked." Eleanor took the basket automatically, her mind reeling. "Arthur told you? When he never once mentioned this place to me in 35 years of marriage." Martha's expression softened into something that looked like deep understanding mixed with a profound pity. "Oh, honey, Arthur came here regularly for 35 years, once a month at the very least. He maintained the house, took care of the property as best he could. He told us that when he died, his wife Eleanor would inherit this place. He said you wouldn't know about it beforehand because he had to keep it secret, for your protection." "My protection?" Eleanor felt as if the ground beneath her feet was shifting. "Protection from what?" "From them, I imagine," Martha said gently, gesturing vaguely toward the direction of Chicago. "The ones who took everything else. His children from the first marriage. Arthur said they never accepted you, that they always resented him marrying you. If they knew about this property, they would find legal ways to tie it up in court for decades and bleed you dry, so he hid it from everyone, even you, until his death made the inheritance final and unchangeable by any judge." Martha started walking toward the house, gesturing for Eleanor to follow. "Come on, I'll help you get settled. The door is unlocked. Arthur never locked it. He said if anyone in Oakhaven needed shelter, they were welcome to it. That's the kind of man he was, at least out here." Eleanor followed Martha up the stone steps. She pulled the rusty brass key from her pocket, but as Martha had said, the door wasn't locked. She stepped across the threshold, and her entire understanding of reality shattered into a million pieces. The interior was not decrepit, it was immaculate. The main floor was a massive open space with wide plank wood floors glowing with the patina of age and careful polishing. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. The furniture was simple but of incredible quality. A worn leather sofa, built-in bookshelves filled with leather-bound classics, and hand-woven rugs in muted, warm colors. But it wasn't the architecture that made Eleanor gasp and cover her mouth with trembling hands. It was the walls, everywhere, covering every available inch of wall space. Arranged on shelves, standing on side tables, were framed photographs. Photographs of Eleanor. Eleanor on their wedding day, young and radiant. Eleanor in the garden of the Chicago mansion, kneeling in the dirt with a smudge of soil on her cheek and genuine joy in her eyes. Eleanor laughing at something off camera. Eleanor reading in a chair, the afternoon sunlight catching her graying hair. Eleanor sleeping peacefully on what looked like the porch of this very house. Hundreds of photographs spanning 3.5 decades of their marriage, all of them carefully framed, beautifully displayed like a private museum dedicated entirely to her. "He loved you very much," Martha said quietly from behind her. Anyone who saw this place knew that immediately. This was his shrine to you, his secret place where he could come and remember who he really was, beneath all the expectations and the performance of his Chicago life. For the first time since Arthur had died, Eleanor didn't just cry. She broke. Surrounded by overwhelming, undeniable evidence that Arthur had treasured her, that he had built an entire sanctuary dedicated to their life together, she fell to her knees and sobbed. Martha let her cry for several long minutes, then gently guided her to sit on the leather sofa. "Let me show you the rest," Martha said softly. "Then I'll leave you to process everything. But first you need to understand what Arthur really left you." Martha led Eleanor through the house, showing her a charming blend of an antique kitchen and modern appliances, and upstairs to a master bedroom overlooking the forest. But the most important room was hidden behind a door under the staircase. It was a small, windowless study. 3 walls were lined floor to ceiling with built-in bookshelves, holding dozens of heavy, meticulously labeled document boxes and binders. The 4th wall contained a beautiful antique mahogany desk with a green-shaded banker's lamp, and there in the very center of the desk, positioned with clear, deliberate intent, was a thick, cream-colored envelope. "My beloved Eleanor" was written across it in Arthur's familiar, precise script. "This," Martha said softly, "is what he really wanted you to find. This is why he built the Haven." Eleanor picked up the envelope with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped it. She broke the heavy wax seal and pulled out 5 pages covered in Arthur's handwriting. "My dearest, most beloved Eleanor, if you are reading this, I am gone and you have found the Haven. I am desperately, profoundly sorry it had to happen this way. I am sorry I couldn't share this place with you while I was alive. But Robert, Victoria, and Julian were always watching, always waiting for any excuse to challenge my decisions, any opportunity to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. If they had known about this property, they would have found ways to take it. Lawyers can always find ways, so I hid it. For 35 years, I hid it and protected it for you. Eleanor, I know what my will said. I know how much those words must have hurt you. Sitting in that lawyer's office, hearing yourself described as adequately compensated for domestic services. Please, please understand, I wrote it that way deliberately, with cold calculation, because I knew my children would read every single word, looking for ways to challenge anything that went to you. I gave them exactly what they wanted: the visible wealth, the obvious assets, the things they could brag about to their friends. I gave them the Lake Forest mansion, which is actually mortgaged to the hilt and will cost them hundreds of thousands in property taxes and historical preservation requirements that I carefully built into the deed years ago. I gave them investment accounts that are locked up in complex trusts, requiring them to pass annual, grueling financial and character evaluations. I gave them exactly enough rope to hang themselves financially, while they think they've won everything. But you, my most beloved Eleanor, I gave you everything that actually matters. This house sits on 300 acres of protected woodland. I had the property assessed last year. It's worth approximately $4.5 million to conservation groups who have already expressed serious interest in purchasing it. But more importantly than any monetary value, I gave you freedom. The trust fund I established at the local bank will cover all property expenses, utilities, taxes, maintenance, insurance for the next 50 years. You will never have to worry about money for this place. The deed is in your name only, established as a gift completely separate from our marriage in 1989. It is legally untouchable. There is more. The filing cabinets in this study contain documents I've accumulated over 35 years of business, information about powerful families, my own partners, and most importantly, my own children. If Robert, Victoria, or Julian ever discover this property and try to challenge your ownership, if they ever try to make your life difficult, you have the means to protect yourself. The files labeled with their names contain documentation of financial dealings and personal matters they would very much prefer stayed private. Use it only if you must, but know that it is there. You were the best part of my life, Eleanor. I'm sorry I was too much of a coward to stand up to my children's judgment while I was alive. I prioritized keeping the peace over publicly defending the woman I loved. I failed you in life by being weak. I hope I have succeeded in death by being clever. Forever and always yours, Arthur. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, each reading revealing new layers of meaning and understanding. Arthur had been deeply flawed. He had been weak when he should have been strong, silent when he should have spoken up. But his love for her had been the one thing he was absolutely certain about. Eleanor carefully folded the letter and set it back on the desk. She turned to the filing cabinets Arthur had mentioned. She opened the top drawer and found exactly what he had described. Property deeds showing her sole ownership, financial documents detailing the 50-year trust fund, and legal papers confirming everything he had written. Then she opened the third cabinet, a thick folder labeled Robert, Victoria, and Julian trust documents and personal records. She pulled it out and sat at Arthur's desk to read. What she found was devastating in its thoroughness and brilliant in its execution. Arthur had given his children exactly what they wanted in exactly the way that would make them utterly miserable, and he had given Eleanor freedom, security, and an impenetrable fortress. For the first time in 35 years sitting in Arthur's chair, in this secret house that belonged solely to her, Eleanor began to laugh. After months of shock, grief, humiliation, and terror, she sat in the study and laughed until her sides ached, both her and Martha understanding the brilliant, patient, perfectly legal revenge Arthur had orchestrated from beyond the grave. For the first 2 weeks in Oakhaven, Eleanor lived in a state of quiet, healing disbelief. The haven was everything Arthur had promised, warm, secure, and entirely paid for. Martha visited daily, bringing fresh produce and stories of the Arthur that Oakhaven knew, a generous, quiet man who had anonymously funded the town library's roof repair and paid for a local girl's college tuition. Eleanor was finally breathing. But peace, when you're dealing with people like the Sterlings, is usually just the eye of the hurricane. On a crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Eleanor had left Chicago, she received a phone call from Arthur's estate attorney. Eleanor, the lawyer said, his voice tight with anxiety. Robert called me yesterday. He's retained aggressive litigation attorneys. They've done a deep dive into Arthur's asset history. And? Eleanor asked, surprising herself with how steady her own voice sounded. They've discovered the haven. They've had the acreage appraised. Robert is arguing that the Michigan property was deliberately undervalued and hidden and that it constitutes a major marital asset subject to division. He intends to take you to court, force the sale of the land to a developer, and split the proceeds 4 ways. Eleanor looked around Arthur's study, her eyes resting on the third filing cabinet. Let him try, Eleanor said softly. I have documentation proving this property was deeded to me as a separate gift in 1989. It's ironclad. I know it is. The lawyer sighed. I drafted it myself, but Eleanor, Robert's lawyers will drag this out for years. They will freeze your assets. They will make your life a living hell just out of spite. I've lived through 35 years of their spite, Eleanor replied calmly. I think it's time they experienced mine. 3 days later, a sleek, black Range Rover crawled up the dirt road and parked aggressively in front of the haven. Eleanor watched from the upstairs window as Robert, Victoria, and Julian stepped out. They were dressed in designer coats, looking wildly out of place in the Michigan woods. But what Eleanor noticed most were their faces. The arrogant smirks they had worn at the will reading were gone. Instead, as they took in the sprawling stone estate, the vast acreage, and the clear multi-million-dollar value of the property, their expressions twisted into hungry, resentful calculation. Eleanor didn't rush. She smoothed her cardigan, walked slowly downstairs, and opened the heavy oak door before they could even knock. "Hello, Robert? Victoria?" "Julian," she said pleasantly, her voice echoing the practiced grace of a society hostess. "Would you care to come in? It's quite chilly out there." They followed her inside in stunned silence. Eleanor watched their eyes dart around, taking in the antique furniture, the glowing fireplace, and most importantly, the hundreds of framed photographs of Eleanor covering the walls. The realization that their father had built a secret shrine to his wife, the woman they had treated like a servant, was visibly suffocating them. Eleanor gestured gracefully to the leather sofas in the sitting room. "Please sit, I'll bring tea." She served them tea using a beautiful antique silver set she had found in the pantry. She moved with absolute composure, completely in control of the room. They had clearly expected to find her broken, desperate, perhaps living in squalor. Instead, she was radiating a quiet, terrifying power. Robert cleared his throat, setting his teacup down with a sharp clatter. "Eleanor," he began, adopting his best corporate negotiator voice, "we're here to discuss a misunderstanding regarding Father's will. Specifically, the value of this estate." "A misunderstanding?" Eleanor asked, taking a delicate sip of her Earl Grey. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Victoria leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Dad clearly didn't comprehend the true market value of this land when he wrote that ridiculous clause leaving it to you. Now that our legal team has looked into it, this property is worth millions to developers. As his primary heirs, we have a legal right to our share of all significant marital assets." "This property isn't a marital asset," Eleanor said calmly, setting her cup down. "It was deeded to me in 1989 as a personal gift, entirely separate from the Chicago estate. I have the documentation to prove it." "We don't believe that will hold up in court," Julian said, speaking for the first time. "We think any asset of this magnitude should be considered joint property. We're prepared to litigate. Then I suppose you'll have to take me to court?" Eleanor smiled slightly. "But before you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on lawyers, I think there is something you should see." Eleanor stood up, walked to Arthur's study, and returned with the thick manila folder labeled with their names. She laid it directly in the center of the coffee table, right between the silver teapot and Robert's designer shoes. "This folder," Eleanor said, her voice dropping an octave, "contains detailed documentation about the trusts your father actually established for your inheritances. Trusts with incredibly strict conditions that you are going to discover very soon when you try to access your cash." She paused, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "It also contains information about various personal and business matters that your father collected over 35 years. You see, Arthur documented everything he learned about everyone in Chicago society, including his own children. He never used the information because he believed it was unethical, but he kept it meticulously organized and he left it all to me." Robert's face went completely pale. "You're bluffing?" "I never bluff, Robert," Eleanor said softly. "Your father taught me that. For instance, Robert, there are highly detailed documents in here regarding your offshore accounts and some creative accounting at your investment firm that the SEC would find fascinating. Victoria, the financial arrangements during your second divorce weren't entirely above board, were they, Arthur? Kept the paper trail of the assets you hid from the judge. And Julian, your startup company has some major compliance violations that your investors are currently unaware of." Eleanor stood up, towering over the three of them sitting on the sofa. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't crying. She was executing a flawless checkmate. "Arthur collected information the way some people collect stamps," she continued. "He never weaponized it because he was a coward when it came to his children. But he gave me the option to use it if I ever needed to protect myself from your greed." She crossed her arms. "So here is my offer. And I want to be crystal clear, this is the only offer I am going to make. Walk away, accept the will exactly as it was written, go back to Chicago and live your lives with your complicated trusts, and that historic mansion that is currently bleeding you dry in preservation taxes, leave me alone in my haven. We never have to see or speak to each other again. But if you challenge me in court, if you try to take this land from me, or make my life difficult in any way whatsoever. I will release every single piece of information your father collected about you, your reputations, your careers, your carefully manicured social standings in Chicago. All of it will burn to the ground. Do you understand me?" The room was dead silent. The three stepchildren looked at the thick folder on the table, then at each other, and finally, they truly looked at Eleanor. Perhaps for the first time in 35 years, they didn't see a glorified maid. They didn't see an easy target. They saw a woman holding a loaded gun, with her finger resting calmly on the trigger, daring them to give her a reason to pull it. We'll need to discuss this privately." Robert finally choked out, his voice tight and strained. "Of course," Eleanor said, her polite society smile returning flawlessly. "Take all the time you need, but understand this property is mine. It was always meant to be mine. Your father loved you in his own complicated, guilty way, but he loved me more. He just didn't have the courage to show it publicly until after he was gone." Without another word, Robert, Victoria and Julian stood up. They didn't touch their tea. They walked out the heavy oak door, climbed into their expensive Range Rover, and drove away, looking utterly ridiculous and defeated on the dusty Michigan dirt road. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched the dust settle behind their car. Then she went back inside, closed the door, and sat in Arthur's favorite leather chair by the window. For the first time since the day Arthur died, she cried. But these were not tears of grief or confusion or pain. They were tears of pure, unadulterated relief. The war was over, and she had won. Eleanor just delivered one of the most brilliant, satisfying checkmates in history. She turned 35 years of being underestimated into an impenetrable shield. Before we reveal the beautiful final chapter of Eleanor's life, and the ultimate secret gift Arthur left waiting for her when the dust finally settled, I want to ask you something. If you felt that rush of justice when those greedy stepchildren were sent packing, if you have ever been erased by the people who should have valued you but you refuse to let them break your spirit, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel right now. Go down to the comments and type the word unstoppable and tell us about the exact moment you realized your worth didn't come from how others treated you, but from the strength inside your own heart. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that their dreams don't have an expiration date. Because as Eleanor is about to prove, the greatest chapters of our lives often begin exactly when the world thinks we are finished. 6 months later, Eleanor sat on the restored stone porch of the Haven, holding a mug of coffee, watching the Michigan forest transition into a masterpiece of autumn gold and crimson. The seasons had changed completely, and so had she. Robert, Victoria, and Julian had dropped their legal threats within 48 hours of driving away from Oak Haven. The paperwork was finalized. The estate was closed, and Eleanor never heard from them again. Word eventually reached her that the Chicago mansion had finally sold, but only after lingering on the market for 8 months. Thanks to the heavy mortgages and the strict historical preservation laws Arthur had secretly tied to the deed, the stepchildren netted a fraction of what they had anticipated. Arthur's revenge had been perfectly legal and absolutely devastating. With the threat gone, Eleanor had spent the last 6 months doing something she hadn't done in 35 years. She made choices entirely for herself. She transformed the Haven from Arthur's secret memorial shrine into her own living, breathing home. She didn't erase him. She kept her favorite photos of their life together, but she took down the excessive frames to make room for her own art. She updated the kitchen not for a catering staff, but for her own love of baking. She hired locals to help restore the wild gardens, not to make them perfect, but to let them bloom freely. And most importantly, Eleanor began to actually live in Oak Haven. For 35 years in Chicago society, she had been a +1, Arthur's shadow. But here, in this tiny lakeside town, she was just Eleanor. She volunteered at the local library on Tuesdays. She joined the town's gardening committee. She found a true, deep friendship with Martha, the general store owner, spending hours drinking coffee and sharing stories on Martha's porch. For the first time in her adult life, Eleanor had a community that valued her for her heart, not for the name on her husband's bank account. One rainy afternoon, while organizing the very last of Arthur's paperwork in the study, Eleanor found a false bottom in the lower drawer of his antique desk. Inside was one final, sealed envelope. The handwriting simply said, "For Eleanor's future, open when the dust settles." She broke the seal. Inside was a deed to an adjoining 20-acre plot of land that sat right on the edge of the lake, complete with a beautiful rustic barn. Next to it was banking documentation for a newly matured trust fund containing $500,000. It wasn't tied to the house. It wasn't tied to maintenance. There was a small sticky note attached to the bank statement in Arthur's handwriting. For your future, whatever you want it to be, build something, create something, or just spend it on yourself. This is your blank canvas. Paint it however makes you happy. You spent 35 years living my life, Eleanor. Now, please, go live yours. Eleanor smiled through tears. A blank canvas. She thought back to those agonizing 30 days in the Chicago mansion. She remembered the suffocating terror of being 65 years old, feeling discarded, invisible, and terrified of the future. She remembered the hundreds of other women she had met in her life who had sacrificed their own dreams to build up their husbands, only to be left with nothing when the music stopped. Suddenly, Eleanor knew exactly what she was going to paint on her blank canvas. She used the trust fund to renovate the rustic barn and build small, cozy guest cottages on the 20-acre lakeside plot. She named it the Horizon Retreat. It became a sanctuary for older women who had been abandoned, widowed, or were forced to start over late in life. A place for them to find shelter, discover a supportive community, and take the time to figure out their next chapter without fear. Arthur had built a secret fortress to protect her. Now she was turning that fortress into a lighthouse to protect others. As the sun began to set behind the ancient oak trees, painting the vast Michigan sky in breathtaking shades of violent orange, deep purple, and soft pink, Eleanor stood on the porch, looking out at the water. She thought about the extraordinary, painful journey that had brought her here, the devastating humiliation of the will reading, the absolute terror of starting over with nothing but 3 suitcases and a rusty brass key, and then the revelation, the slow, beautiful understanding that true love sometimes protects itself in the most unconventional ways. Arthur had handed her power disguised as worthlessness. He had given her freedom disguised as abandonment. He had trusted that she was strong enough to survive the storm and wise enough to find the sanctuary waiting on the other side. Eleanor Sterling took a deep breath of the crisp, pine-scented air. She was 65 years old. For decades, she had been exactly what everyone else needed her to be: the perfect wife, the invisible stepmother, the quiet caregiver. But standing here, surrounded by the towering trees, her incredible friends, and a legacy built entirely on her own terms, she finally knew who she was beneath all those roles. She wasn't fading away into the winter of her life. She was free, she was powerful, and as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, Eleanor smiled, realizing that her life was just beginning.